I'm ready. So I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. And the topic is working with individuals with intellectual disabilities and sexual behavior problems by Robin Wilson. And before I introduce Robin, I want to tell you a little bit about NERI Press. And our mission at NERI Press is to share cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. And I say our field because all of us here are professionals who work in the field with you. And it's really important to us as we offer you these webinars and other knowledge features that I'll talk about in a second, if we have some input and feedback from you. So we really appreciate your suggestions for topics, things that worked on the webinar or didn't, and we love to hear from you. So please don't be shy. We love the feedback, good, bad, or ugly. So a little bit more about NERI Press. For many years, we were only a book publisher, but with changes in the publishing world, we're exploring now what it means to maintain our mission, but move towards a broader definition of our work is really as a knowledge dissemination entity. And in the last 5 years with that goal, we've begun to offer online courses, newsletters, and now most recently, these webinars by some of our internationally recognized authors. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about this issue again, but if you find these webinars helpful, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of this series. So it's a little bit like National Public Radio. It's your donations that help make this series happen. And like NPR, we also offer you a free gift of 2 of our books, Current Perspectives and Current Applications. So truly, this kind of support allows us to continue to bring you these free resources. So let me take a moment to introduce our speaker, and I'm really delighted and thrilled to do so. Because I've had the pleasure of working with Robin for a long time, and I've learned a great deal from him. Robin is a PhD, a doctorate, and an AP BP. He's a researcher, educator, and board-certified clinical psychologist who's worked with sexual and other offenders for more than 27 years. He's president of the Florida Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers and is the elected Southern Regional Representative on the board of ATSA. Dr. Wilson is presently the editor of the ATSA Forum and administering the blog spot. As with all workshops, I want to tell you what our learning objectives are today. First of all, we want to review perspectives on assessment and management. Second, to learn the challenges of adapting evidence-based practices to special needs populations. Third, to compare and contrast methods used in working with people with and without intellectual disabilities and problem sexual behaviors, and finally review opportunities for healthy sexual behavior. Also let you know that we will be posting this PowerPoint on the NERI Press website shortly after the presentation, and we'll be posting a recording of the webinar sometime next week. Couple instructions for all of you who are listening. When the workshop's over, please be sure to close out your account because we'll be sending you an evaluation. And again, we truly would love your feedback if you would take the moment to do it. And fourth, for those of you who are interested, and some of you may be, we're now offering CE credits for these webinars at a very nominal cost. And if you're interested, go to the website for NERI Press for more information. And finally, after about a week, we'll send you a follow-up email that has a link to the recordings and a link to the certificate of completions. And last, before I turn this over to Robin, I want to highlight the book that Robin has produced, which is Intellectual Disabilities and Problems in Sexual Behavior. Based upon years of work in Canada, in fact, the royalties of this book go back to the dynamic program Robin created there. I could say a lot more about it, but I think all of you want to be hearing directly from one of the authors. So, Dr. Robin Wilson, welcome, and I'm very glad to be turning this over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for that. I'm going to get myself up here, show my screen, okay, and share my webcam. So there, I hope you can all see me, sitting in my office in my home in Sarasota, Florida. Before I get started, just a couple of things. First of all, sorry to Steve, obviously I didn't update my bio with you. Most of the nice things you said to me are things that I used to be. So I'm no longer the president of FATSA, I'm now the past president, and I recently cycled off the board of ATSA and also passed on the duties for the forum and the blog to others as well. I found myself saddled with some very time-consuming stuff this year and had to find a way to make some space. Other than that, the only other thing I would say is that I certainly wouldn't say that I created the program in Canada, although I certainly have had a hand in little bits and pieces of it. Those bits of credit belong to other people. So this afternoon, what I'd like to talk about with you is working with people with intellectual disabilities and problems in sexual behavior. And this is, of course, the title of the book that Steve just referred to. See if I can get my stuff to go. Why is that not working? Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is the book. And again, as Steve said, this is not necessarily shameless self-promotion, and that I don't actually get any money from this myself. Okay. All of the royalties for this go back into the program that we continue to run up in essentially Toronto, Canada. So within the context of this webinar, what we're talking about is really a kind of expanded intellectual disability. And I guess for the most part, we're talking about people who have any impaired cognitive ability. So we're talking about some brain injury folks that have some autism spectrum issues, fetal alcohol stuff, intellectual development disorder, and as I said, other things that would interfere with their ability to think and learn and express themselves as others do. Some of the difficulties that they face, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but the problems in being able to express themselves, as I said, and it's not just in terms of what they say to others, but also in terms of being able to understand what people say to them. There are a lot of sort of practical issues that many folks with ID face in terms of just being able to do things that most of us take for granted, like look after ourselves, make friends, negotiate friendly relationships, being able to make decisions for themselves, being sort of safe, and being able to look after one's health care. And of course, the focus of what we're going to talk about today comes down to sexuality. Here's a quote from a judge in Canada. "Herein lies the problem relating to the commission of sexual offenses. Having a mature body beyond his intellect, he has urges for sexual gratification, which leads to impulsiveness and unpremeditated behavior without using caution and with risk-taking. This is followed by non-comprehension that the behavior was inappropriate." And we sometimes see this in our clients. I mean, certainly there are some intellectually disabled folks who are not particularly disabled, and they have a pretty good grasp of what's going on. And they certainly do engage in sexual behaviors that become offensive at times to others, and know that what they're doing is not probably the world's best choice. But certainly there are others who don't comprehend on the same level as we do that the responses that they're having to their sexual needs mightn't necessarily cause difficulties for others. We'll talk a little bit about dynamic risk assessment. As you know, we've certainly seen lots in the last 15 years or so about looking at static factors in the static 99R and static 2002R, or whatever other scale you may have some preference for. These scales have reasonable tenure, and we've been using them to anchor our risk judgments for a reasonable period of time now. We're just recently starting to shift ourselves to not looking solely at static risk factors, but also looking at some of the dynamic predictors, or as Ruth Mann and her friends call them, kind of psychologically meaningful risk factors. When we look at them, though, I mean, the dynamic risk variables are very much related to how a person interacts with the world, and can have a lot to do with lifestyle management, personality preferences, or personality variables, and patternized behavior. And given the list that we saw before with some of the difficulties that people with intellectual disabilities face, it's reasonable to expect that many people with ID are going to face some fairly serious challenges in terms of some of the sort of day-to-day psychologically meaningful activities that we all, again, take somewhat for granted. So, just for instance, something as simple as kind of relationship stability. When we're looking at a tool like, say, for instance, the Stable 2007, one of the items in there talks about whether or not the client has been able to develop an age-appropriate intimate relationship with someone else and to have that last for a reasonable period of time without problems. Given that many of our intellectually disabled clients find themselves in institutional settings or perhaps community group homes, forming relationships where they could truly meet the intent of an item like a kind of relationship stability that I was just speaking about makes it pretty difficult for them. And then in terms of access to other activities in the community, it's difficult for them to sort of demonstrate the competencies that we're looking for in terms of having their their dynamic risk picture be something that would make us feel a little more comfortable. So in terms of looking at these kinds of risk factors, differential diagnosis, individualized case planning can be kind of difficult, and really, I think at times asks us to be somewhat creative in terms of how we're going to interpret some of these variables. One scale that's starting to gain some favor within the intellectually disabled field is a tool called the Armadillo, which is largely the brainchild of Jim Hoven and Doug Bauer. And it's an interesting way of getting your acronym, I suppose. But if you go to their website, which I think is armadillo.net, they've got a nice picture of an armadillo there and lots of stuff that you can look at that will give you some sense about this. But what I like about the Armadillo is that it doesn't just look at the client domains, it also looks at the environmental stuff, which I think is so critical, and it sort of harkens back to what I just talked about a moment ago. Because many of our clients find themselves in settings where they are in care or where they're getting a lot of sort of interjection from other people that people who don't have intellectual disabilities wouldn't necessarily see, that because there's so much influence from either the place where they're living or the staff who are working with them, that it's also probably pretty important to have a look at that. In that these can exert great force on the risk picture or on the sort of protective factor aspect as well. If you find yourself living in a group home that has very poor supervision, then you can see how some of the issues that some clients might have would be exacerbated. Or if you find yourself in a group home that has very tight constraints on interpersonal behavior or in terms of personal sexual behavior, you might see some inappropriate sexual problem solving or some other issues that might come up simply as a consequence of clients not having reasonable access to sexuality. So, and much like the other dynamic risk scales, we look at sort of stable factors and also acute factors. And I would encourage you to go to the Armadillo website within the context of what we're talking about here. I don't have really the time to go through all the variables with you, but I find this a useful scale. The other thing I really like about it as well is that each factor comes sort of two-sided. There's the risk element, things that might contribute to problems, and then there's also a way of conceptualizing each of the variables as being potentially protective. So there's an intention here to also consider that there may be things that are going right in the client's life and that we want to make sure that we catch those as well, so that we can offset some of the difficulties with some of the things that are not really presenting as much problem. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about treatment and intervention. Of course, being from Canada, I would be remiss if I didn't speak at least very briefly about Andrews and Bonta. Most of us in the sex offender treatment, risk assessment, management world are probably well familiar with the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. What we don't often recognize is that the R&R principles are really part of an overall psychology of criminal conduct. And this is just but one piece. So if you truly want to know the whole story, I would strongly encourage you to have a look at the Andrews and Bonta book. This is the 2010 version. I think there may be a sixth edition on the way, but this is a fascinating book, not an easy read, but certainly one that's well worth it if you want to have a good grasp of why we do the things we do in our business. From my perspective, all of us, I'm going to assume everybody who is on this webinar in one way or another is either a clinician or some concerned practitioner, someone who has interface with persons with intellectual disabilities and problematic sexual behavior. And for me, my goal in my practice has always been to try to help clients develop what I call balanced self-determined lifestyles. I'd love to be able to say that I coined this term myself, but I didn't. I actually steal this from essentially what was the Saskatchewan New Start version of a life skills program started in the 1960s. If you ever have a chance to look at this, it's a precursor to Good Lives, very much a strength-based approach. The idea here, if we unpack this phrase, is that people strive for balance. Yeah, and if you put it into Good Lives framework, you have your sort of basic human needs or goods, things that each of us need to achieve or to attain in order to have some degree of balance in our life. And sort of practically speaking, when you put too much effort into any one of those domains, you do so to the detriment of some other area. So we might argue that people who engage in sexual offending are more concerned about their own needs than the needs of others, more self-focused than other-focused, and this imbalance is what causes them to get into trouble. But it's not just about the balance, it's also about self-determination. As a species, we very much dislike being told what to do. We like to be able to make decisions for ourselves. We like the freedom to make our own choices and to have some reasonable roster of things that we can decide between as we go through our weeks and months and years of our lives. As you can imagine, within the sex offending population generally, many of our clients find themselves either incarcerated or under supervision, where the concept of self-determination might not be as broad as for a private citizen who's not involved with the system. If we look at the intellectually disabled population, this becomes even more so an issue, given that many of them have a difficult time making decisions for themselves. And as I mentioned before, within either the institutional or group home setting, the opportunities for self-determination can be somewhat blunted. So if we want our clients to keep moving forward, the idea is to promote balance, but at the same time give them increasing opportunities to make decisions for themselves. I've found at least that this certainly helps. And of course, the little bit with the asterisk, of course, we always have to keep safety in mind. In terms of the sort of behavioral difficulties we see in our adult clients, and I am going to focus mostly on adults today, but here we'll talk a little bit about some of the precursor behavior. So when we look at children with intellectual disabilities, we see a lot of the sorts of things that may become a bit of an issue for us later in life when we're trying to manage inappropriate social behavior or perhaps awkward social behavior. So children with ID tend to be impulsive, uninhibited, overly friendly, wanting hugs and high fives and fist bumps from virtually everybody, including strangers. They can be intrusive at times. They may have some poor social skills. Sometimes they inject themselves into situations just purely because of that, sort of inquisitiveness. And sometimes, this can be annoying, I suppose, for some people. For the most part, we wouldn't have much difficulty if, if a Down syndrome child or if some other child with an intellectual disability, kind of injected themselves into our moment. We would probably be fairly tolerant of that. As people get older, I'm talking about the clients with ID, as they get older, we become less tolerant of that. In terms of how we need to keep these kinds of things in mind when we're building interventions for our clients later on, there are a number of different things with respect to treatment that we need to consider. There are lots of different treatment packages, and we've certainly got well more than our fair share of things that we can rely on. But as I said before, we need to be pretty inventive, pretty creative when taking these sort of tried and true methods, some of which may work with the intellectually disabled population, some of which may not. Because communication can be such an issue, and many of our clients may indeed be nonverbal, we need to reduce our reliance on written materials. As much as possible, using visual sorts of things or being able to demonstrate in sort of in vivo can really be helpful. One of the things that we've done with some of our clients at the Peel Behavioral Service, where where this book and where this webinar, I suppose, in some respects emanates from, with some of our clients who have a difficult time comprehending behavior, what we've done is actually to make little mini videos. So we get the client to work together with his case manager to sort of script how he would behave in a certain set of circumstances, almost like writing a screenplay. And then we get out the video camera and using some of the other clients from group, perhaps, or some of the other staff, we get the client to actually act this out, to follow the script while we videotape it, so that we can then show it back to him and he can have a chance to see how he behaved and how he was able to negotiate that circumstance. And we found this has been really, really helpful in terms of being able to build an individual's capacity and really, sort of that belief in themselves that they can do it. We also know that practice is important, that, certainly with respect to sexuality, some education, but depending on the client and depending on the circumstances, we do need to make sure that we provide enough supervision and structure that we're keeping people safe and keeping people from being put into situations where they may act in a way that puts others at risk for harm. And I'll just note one thing. I don't have a slide on this, but there's some current discussion. I sort of hesitate to call it controversy, but there's some discussion within the field of working with persons with intellectual disabilities, really persons with disabilities in total, about rights. The right to have opportunities, the right to have the same opportunities that others who are not disabled have. And for a very, very long time, we didn't necessarily give persons with disabilities the same opportunities in life as others. And I think sometimes that was well-meaning. Sometimes I think we did that more as an overprotectiveness, or perhaps because we had some, disbelief that they were able to manage it. I'm all for giving people opportunities and for emphasizing the rights of persons with disabilities. I think one of those rights also, however, is the right to good treatment, the right to good assessment, and the right to good risk management. So sometimes, much like in our private lives, there are times when we might need to think outside of the box, and although a certain person may have a right to engage in a certain type of behavior, depending on how that behavior might interfere with others, we might consider that the right to good guidance may supersede. So anyhow, just to go back to this list, there are a number of different areas where we need to look at some modifications for treatment. Being predictable, being clear, active teaching, The idea I just talked about with the video, that was a way for us to do some very active teaching with that client. Sometimes medication is necessary, and this population tends to have more psychiatric needs than the non-disabled population. And I'm a big believer in sort of consequences for behavior, but that the consequences have to be meaningful. Harkening back to the responsivity principle, this is, I think, where really we need to focus. We certainly have lots of ideas around risk and need, and we can identify those needs. We can identify risk level. We can focus on needs, but really, I think the real strength of a good program is in how it interfaces with its clients. How do we respond to their needs on an individual basis? How do we make sure that we're actually providing them with something that they can take away? So again, getting back to the idea of making sure that things are simple, not overly simplified, not to the point of being perhaps kind of pejorative, but certainly having things be simple, concrete, redundant. In the bottom there, Joan put this on the slide for me. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Practice makes perfect, right? Some of you will know that I'm an amateur musician, and at least once a day I pick up one of my guitars just to keep my fingers limber, because I know that I need to practice in order to keep up my skill level. And the same is true for virtually everybody and virtually everything, but it's particularly so for clients who have disabilities that might interfere with their ability to retain certain things. And of course, culturally relevant, keeping in mind that in a way, or maybe not in a way, maybe just certainly dead on so, intellectual disability can be a culture. So we need to keep in mind that there are things that come into the room with the client that we aren't necessarily seeing, and having a good interface with our client and being able to sit down and be as open and as engaging as possible will really help. In terms of that, managing the environmental side of things, structure and support are important. As I said, some of our clients will be in either institutional or group home settings, and certainly that can be helpful. And for some of our higher risk clients, having on-site awake staff is certainly helpful. Some of our clients will require 24/7 supervision. Some will require eyes-on supervision. Some will require arm's length supervision, depending on the degree to which they can manage themselves, either when they're alone. Certainly some of our clients have risk to themselves for self-injurious behavior, but in terms of how they get along with others. Some of our clients are able, either from the beginning or after some time in treatment, are able to function in either assisted living or semi-independent living environments with some day staff coming for an hour or two here or there. So we focus for the most part here about clients with intellectual disabilities who become offenders, but we shouldn't forget that there's the other side of this as well. Because these clients are so often in care from an early time in their life, they're unfortunately very easy to prey on. And the victimization statistics within the intellectually disabled population are truly alarming. Dave Hingsberger, who's certainly a pioneer in our field, has done some research that suggests that greater than 90% of persons with intellectual disabilities who are in either group homes or schools or hospital settings, those kinds of places, that 90% or greater of them have been victimized at some point. So I think that we need to really keep in mind that many of the traits that increase the risk for victimizing in this population may also increase their risk to be victimized. And what I'm referring to there is their at times diminished capacity to understand the social dynamic and to be able to manage their sexual behavior in a reasonable fashion. One of the other points here is that, of course, trauma for all of us tends to blunt us. Those people who've experienced extreme trauma will have some great difficulties with managing emotions, being able to realistically interact with others on an emotional level. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking at our clients with intellectual disabilities. If they have a personal history of problems in being abused, especially sexual abuse, that will be a factor that needs to be attended to in treatment just as much as the risk they pose to others might need to be. And certainly isolation is always a big factor in need of some attention. So let's talk a little bit about healthy sexuality before we wrap up and finish it off. So as I said before, I'm a strong believer that people with disabilities should have the same opportunities in life as the rest of us, within reason and where that's safe and where that's reasonable to happen. So where possible, they should have options for safe, healthy, loving, consenting relationships. That we should support these relationships, and we should give them some opportunities to learn how to be appropriately sexual in their lives. For many of our clients, tragically, that will be mostly sexuality on their own. Getting back to the beginning is difficult for many clients in these circumstances to build relationships with others. But being able to masturbate, to be able to masturbate safely and appropriately, is something that all of our clients have the right to do. When it comes to healthy sexuality education, there's lots of different stuff to talk about, some of which will pertain solely to the client himself or herself, and then some of it will talk about interpersonal things. For our clients, often what got them into trouble with respect to sexuality is a failure to distinguish between public and private behavior. Sometimes they have great difficulties in terms of understanding, sort of age discrimination, and we do a lot of testing with our clients when we're doing assessments, trying to figure out how well they can distinguish children from adolescents from adults, and sometimes there are some great difficulties there. We also need to look at things like STDs and birth control, so that if they do find themselves dating or perhaps in a relationship, perhaps even aiming towards marriage, that they understand what options there are with respect to being healthy about sex. There are, of course, also some challenges, and I find it fascinating always. It's probably one of the things that's kept me in this field so long, is that it never ceases to amaze me the new and unique ways that people express their sexuality. I can honestly say that in 30 years of doing this, I don't think I've ever had a boring day. So, and certainly working with clients with intellectual disabilities, presents challenges that we don't necessarily see even in some of our other clients. So here's my favorite slide of the show, and you can probably see why. So up in the left-hand corner, of course, we have a butt plug. Bottom right-hand corner, that's called a fleshlight. Of course, Dr. Frankenfurter, for those of you who were like me, cut your teeth in the late 70s, early 80s, you'll remember Rocky Horror Picture Show. In the bottom left there, we have some diapers. So why do I show you this? So in the upper left-hand corner, let me tell you a little story. We had a client who liked to do anal insertions. If it was longer than it was wide, he would put it in his bum, and would do so with alarming frequency. And sometimes the things that he was using to do anal insertions were really quite dangerous. And on one occasion, he made a 7-centimeter laceration in his rectum that required hours of surgery. We sort of looked at the situation. We had done everything in our power to get him to stop doing this, or to try to counsel him away from it, given that it was causing some great difficulties for him, and he was doing anal insertions anyway. So, trying to be creative and with a harm reduction sort of mantra in mind, I was thinking to myself, well, it may not be the most palatable thing, or it may not be the thing that most people would come to, but there are actually sex toys created explicitly for this purpose They're designed to fit inside someone's backside without causing harm. So we took him to the sex shop and found him an appropriate butt plug. And although I'm not going to say that completely fixed the problem, it certainly diminished the harm on occasion. Bottom right-hand corner there, the fleshlight, we find that some of our clients have a difficult time in masturbating. And those of you who work with folks with intellectual disabilities will know that there are sometimes some physical limitations as well, in that some of our clients have a hard time, getting their hand, they don't have the manual dexterity to masturbate in a way that's going to be physically pleasing for them. So this fleshlight is an interesting thing. It's kind of like it's a fleshlight, and put a little bit of lube on it. It's easier to hold, and it simulates the feelings of having intercourse, I suppose, to a certain degree. We have a number of our clients who are using these, and I should note before I go too far, we don't just go to the sex shop and hand out anything to anyone. Of course, there are protocols in place, and it's been part of treatment before we got to this point. We want to make sure that we're enhancing someone's sex life without necessarily making it more difficult at the same time. So there's a lot of thought that goes into this. These are actually clinical decisions, not just sort of spur of the moment, hey, let's try to do something creative and sexy for someone. We really do put a lot of thought into this. So anyone who would get a butt plug or a fleshlight would have a protocol for that. The fleshlight side of it, we'd probably have them see Dave Hingsberger's film Handmade Love, which would also be quite useful. In the upper right-hand corner, Dr. Frankenfurter, of course, just like some of our non-disabled clients, some in the intellectually disabled population have some issues with respect to gender, or have some transvestism or some fetishism. And certainly I'm supportive of this, to the extent that it doesn't cause anybody any grief, including the client. If he wants to dress up in garters with some nice pearls and look like Dr. Frankenfurter, why should I care? As long as it doesn't become a problem in the environment where he's living, and it enhances his sex life, by all means, I'm supportive of that. Leaving the bottom left-hand corner here, I really do have some concerns about diapers with our intellectually disabled clients, and that often diapers are a proxy for children. And we find a number of our clients, actually disproportionate number of our clients, who use diapers because they smell like babies. And in fact, they like soiled diapers, whether with feces or with urine, more often urine. Because they like the smell and the idea that this has been used or been touched by a child. Some of our autistic clients like the feeling of diapers, and they use them for masturbatory purposes. The real key point, I guess, here is that if we offer them, kind of depends, an adult diaper, if they're okay with that, then maybe truly it is about the tactile experience. It's about the feel of using, I don't know, whatever a diaper's lined with. All my kids are far too grown for me to know what a diaper's like anymore. And thank God I don't have grandchildren. But if they, sort of resist and say, well, I really like the small ones, especially where there's been some issue with children, either staring or fantasizing or, kind of watching inappropriate television, then we would sort of vote against providing any diapers of this sort, because probably they're just fueling some inappropriate fantasy. So there's some thoughts about being creative in your sexuality work with clients with intellectual disabilities. Closing thoughts. So pulling it all together, our goal is to increase the individual's quality of life, and individualized treatment that we base on the R&R principles can really help us in that respect. With a heavy focus on the second R, we really do have to work harder at being responsive to our clients, given that they don't learn necessarily or behave necessarily in the same way as our non-disabled clients. So we need to create programs that can adapt to reflect the individual needs of those clients. We need to enhance their opportunities. So we want to do a lot of skills development, but we also want to try to the extent possible, increase their knowledge, whether it's, that kind of intellectual knowledge or whether it's, kind of muscle knowledge. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but, in terms of burning pathways, in terms of behavior that, not necessarily always from an intellectual standpoint, but some of it, kind of at a certain level may be reflexive. We also need to think about motivation. There's that word responsivity again. And of course, we often see responsivity and motivation together, given that motivation is a key point of making sure that programs are responsive. And I'll leave you with this quote from another judge from Canada, which I think sums up some of the difficulties we face. The cognitively challenged are before our courts in unknown numbers. We prosecute them again and again and again. We sentence them again and again and again. We imprison them again and again and again. They commit crimes again and again and again. We wonder why they do not change. The wonder of it all is that we do not change. There's the book again, and again, not shameless self-promotion. All the money for this that I would have received goes back into the program for us to develop more and newer and more effective methods to work with our clients. It's my contact details. I didn't say this before, but every workshop, webinar, training session, lecture that I give in my career comes with a lifetime guarantee. If you have any questions about this, by all means, we have a question and answer period now, but I'd be more than happy to receive emails. Most of what I publish is on my website, and you can certainly go there. Thanks a lot, folks. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I think we have some question and answer time now.
Robin, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the kind of humanistic and thoughtful and real way in which you talk about complicated clients. I mean, it's so clear in what you're saying that, one, risk is not just a set of numbers on a page, that we really have to bring back in careful case formulation and creative interventions for clients who have very complex profiles. And I was also struck when you were talking about the video with the whole question of not of content and what to do, but the methodology. And, I think since I run a special ed school and many of our clients have really significant learning challenges or learning disabilities, and the people who are running a lot of these programs are clinicians who were never trained in methodologies of teaching, how much we need to start to integrate the way we're going to deliver information as well as, what we're going to deliver. So I just want to thank you for all that you've said. For those of you who haven't typed in questions, I'm going through here. Let me go back a second. You still can do that. I have a couple of questions that have already come through. So, Robin, I'm going to ask those of you. First of all,
Steve,
somebody wrote in that their first two clients were diagnosed.
Sorry.
Please.
Could I interject? Could you turn on your screen sharing so we can see the Q&A slide from you?
Screen sharing. Tell me where that is, Greg.
I did make you the presenter, so let me. I'll take it back and send it to you again.
Sorry, folks, we got a little technical glitch. So my slide would just say a discussion of question and answer, so I don't want to. There we go. So, are we up and running, Greg? Are we doing well?
And you can also switch on your webcam if you'd like.
Okay, so we'll do that, and then you can see my face as well. Can you see it? Because I can't.
Well, he's got a fancy headset.
Yeah, I do, but you have a fancy microphone, so. Anyway, so here's the first question, Robin. Is just somebody wrote in and said that their first two clients were diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as their primary diagnosis, and I wondered if you could speak about schizophrenia as well as intellectual disability, and knowing, of course, that sometimes there are both factors.
Right. Okay. So of course that's the the double whammy, I suppose, in that they've got lots of issues to face. We certainly have clients like that within our clinic. We've had a number of clients who have some kind of delusional disorders, who are also having some great difficulties with sort of hearing voices. At times, hearing voices that tell them to do things that are inappropriately sexual. So, certainly, as I said before, psychiatry often plays a big part in this. The big difficulty, of course, is that there are so few psychiatrists who are knowledgeable about working with people with sexual behavior issues. Tends not to be something that people in psychiatry want to go into, and I'm not sure exactly why. They have lots of clients. But then just the idea of how do these two things interface with one another. So I see the sort of psychiatry aspects or the kind of psychiatric disorders as being another part of the puzzle when we're trying to build programs that are responsive. So I mean, clearly they need to go and see the psychiatrist and get kind of appropriately medicated. If that's the case, you may need to do some modifications to your treatment programming, but I don't see this as necessarily being an issue that we can't overcome. Of course, it depends on the extent to which the individual is experiencing symptoms, but it's certainly been our experience that once we get the psychiatric issues under management, that we can much more easily deal with the sexual side effects that may be coming from that, or the sexual behavior issues that may be happening, kind of in parallel. That's I suppose, a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope I hit on some of the important bits. So finding a decent psychiatrist who can work well with your clientele is a really important thing that I think most clinics need to develop.
Thanks, Robin. Also, you talk a lot about contextualizing certain elements of client behavior. I have a question here about just the community as well, saying that most times the community hasn't been well prepared for these clients coming back into the community, whether it be group home or independent living or being around them. And the person sending this in said they're concerned that these clients will be discharged from the hospital and after a short period of time become incarcerated, and they're wondering if you had any suggestions about how to coordinate services with law enforcement, other agencies, etc.
Yeah, so this is where the rubber meets the road, of course, in that we've over the last century, I suppose, been really good at institutionalizing people. And of course, in the 50s and 60s through on into the 70s, we had this great deinstitutionalization movement, which I fully support. The problem, however, in the actual practical aspects of that is that although we moved people out of institutions, we didn't necessarily follow them with any money to support them once they reach the individual community where they were headed, such that for all intents and purposes, prisons have become the new hospitals, and we've seen skyrocketing, sort of populations within criminal justice institutions of people with both mental health problems, kind of severe and persistent mental illness, and also intellectual disability and other sorts of things that would kind of limit someone's ability to manage in that so-called normal sense. So when people do come to the community, and this is a funding element, and it always will be. I have been very lucky in that the Peel Behavioral Service that I've been consulting with for the last 15 years is part of a larger hospital. They have a budget, they have great staff, they have access to a roster of group homes who are under contract, and they provide treatment both in the home, in the community. They're able to go on excursions with supervision. That's sort of the best case scenario, and I don't pretend like every community is going to be able to have that. But certainly where you're able to advocate for such services, I mean, that's really the safe way to do it. Both safety for the client himself or herself, but also for those who might be impacted when the client goes back into the community. And sometimes the impact is something relatively benign. Some of our clients like to stare at children. Some of our clients like to stare at others. They don't have the same social skills level. Makes people uncomfortable. Being able to have someone with you to say, hey Joe, don't stare, right? You can look and smile, but then you have to come back to your own stuff. That's certainly important. Looking at the liaison with other agencies, partnerships are always important. In the areas where I've done most of my consulting, we've always sought out the community liaison officer who works with the local police force. Most of them will have somebody who has some responsibility for interfacing with other agencies, especially around sexual behavior issues. So we always try to seek out who that person is and educate them about what we're doing, so that should it happen that we have an incident at one of our group homes where the police do need to be called, as they are arriving, they're understanding what it is that they're going into. This is not, your sort of routine dwelling, that this is a place where people live who have issues, who will require some different handling. So we've had some great success. We don't advocate for our clients not to be charged if they need to be charged, but we do advocate for them to be sensitively handled, and not treated perhaps in exactly the same way that someone without a disability would find themselves. So, certainly partnering when it comes to the police, other social service agencies, people who might be in a position to provide either funding or other support. Always good to know who else in your local neighborhood is doing similar types of things. But I understand that most jurisdictions will be faced by largely financial issues, and if you're lucky enough to have these sorts of things, great. If you're not, I suppose that means that you'll have to take the bull by the horns and go out there and start building some of those partnerships and opportunities. Just maybe a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but I don't know what to say otherwise.
Great, Robin. I think we have time for one more question. And just so you know, we had close to 500 people attending this webinar throughout the presentation. And, I'm sure there are far more questions than I'm able to get to. And so I guess you're open to people contacting you if they want to, correct?
I am.
That'd be fine. But here's the last question for you. There's currently a policy that prevents housing mentally ill registered sex offenders in not only the same building, but in the same housing complex or neighborhood. And this person said that they'd given powers that be a copy of Colorado's research on housing high-risk offenders together, but wondered if you had any other information or suggestions for how to address this whole housing issue.
Yeah, this is fundamentally a problem of ignorance that people don't understand. I suppose some of this we have to own ourselves, in that we in the early days we wanted to emphasize that our clients did pose some degree of risk because people were overlooking the risk, with respect to sexual behavior, and kind of pre-1980s. We kind of swept a lot of this under the carpet, didn't pay very much attention to it. And then all of a sudden, people started listening to us that, indeed, we did have some clients who were risky, but unfortunately, the pendulum swung completely the other direction. And then we had this sort of perspective that everyone was the worst possible anything. And, that didn't help us at all either. So that's partly what we're dealing with now. We have this, sort of monsterization of all sexual offenders. This is particularly enhanced when we look at kind of people with intellectual disabilities who already have something about them that draws attention to them. So to have someone in that sort of life space who also has some issues with respect to sexual behavior, the kind of monster picture becomes that much worse. And people who might normally have been somewhat sympathetic lose their sympathies. So I suppose the big issue here is that we have a lot of well-intentioned but poorly considered and poorly supported, at least by research, policies and practices. And one of these is that sexual offenders can't receive certain services like everyone else. Some of you who have Second Chance Act grants will know that when the Second Chance Act was first released, it was available to all released offenders except sex offenders. And we always seem to do that. You can get this, you can do that, but not if you're a sex offender. We've kind of backed many of these clients back into a corner. So I suppose the best way to do this is through education, to talk to your local politicians, to talk to the people who are making decisions, and to do your very best to emphasize an evidence-based approach, one that uses what we've gotten from the science. From my knowledge, I spent 13, 14 years working in a halfway house that had a limit on the number of sex offenders who could be there. It was I don't remember the census for sure, but let's say that the halfway house would hold 30 people. We could have no more than 6 of them be sex offenders, because people believed that as soon as you put all these sex offenders together, they were going to band together and form a roving gang of sexual deviants who were going to wreak havoc on the local neighborhood. What we knew is that the more sexual offenders we had in the house, actually the better the risk profile of the house. That for the most part, they paid attention to what they needed to. They went to group, they did what they needed to do, and when provided with proper supervision and guidance and opportunities to make changes in their lives, most of our sex offending clients do that. It's a complete and total myth that that all sex offenders are sex offenders all the time, and even the highest risk guys that we see of those who go back to the community. Some recent data from Carl Hansen and his group, if they can manage to develop a balanced, self-determined lifestyle that gets them out of trouble for between 5 and 10 years, the chances that they're going to incur any further sexual offense charges decreases quite dramatically. So I guess again, don't have a great answer for you other than that this is another area where we need to talk about partnerships and making sure that you're giving opportunities to your local decision makers around good policy, good practices, and making sure that sexual offenders have a place to go when they get released. As we know, social isolation and sort of lifestyle instability are part of a dynamic risk, are part of an increased dynamic risk profile. So we want to promote stability. We want to promote the opportunity to be in a place safely and to be linked to others. And of course, just to add to that, give a very, very quick plug to something like Circles of Support and Accountability, which I've been associated with for a little more than 20 years now, which seeks to make sure that people of risk have links to others in the community so as to increase their chances of success and to decrease the chance that more people will be hurt.
Robin, thank you. We're going to, it's just about 4 o'clock now, and we're going to tie this up as quickly as I can. Thanks so much. Just so you know here, we at Neary Press produce a monthly newsletter, Research to Practice in the Field of Adolescent Work. All of you who sign up for the webinar will now be signed up for the newsletter. You certainly can opt out. We hope you find it useful. And we're always looking for new research to highlight. So if you have ideas, once again, we'd love to be involved with all of our audience. We have posted the PowerPoint already on the website, and we will be posting the recording by next week and send you a certificate of completion if you sign off and can answer the evaluation questions. That would be great. If you like this webinar, you can take a look at all the previous ones that are also on our website. I want to just tell you a little bit about the upcoming webinar on November 18th. David Prescott will be talking about the basics of motivational interviewing, and I think many of you know David's work, and this will be another enlightening and very interesting webinar. I hope you can join us. as well. I want to thank our sponsors, without whom we could not offer this free to everybody who's out there, and ask that any of you who have organizations or in a personal capacity to be able to sponsor our workshops, please let us know. We're always looking for new sponsors. Thanks to the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM Group, James Reynolds, Mass Department of Mental Health, Maple Tree Group Homes, New Hope Treatment Centers, Rancho Earlo Society, the Stevens Treatment Program, Wayne County Juvenile Probation, and Yerrick Counseling. Once again, Robin, thank you. It's a pleasure having you. It's a pleasure working with you. Thank you for all the work that you're doing out there for so many years. You're a gift to the field. And thank you all for being part of the webinar, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye now.